So if you are supposed to be at the Emerging Women Leaders in Global Health Initiative seminar, then you are in the right place. We are very excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Mel Salm, today to talk about her leadership journey. But before we launch into that, just a reminder of some rules of engagement. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Share your LinkedIn. Use this as a networking opportunity to meet people with similar interests and from all over the world. But if you find the chat distracting, go ahead and close it. You can always revisit it later, copy out the chat, and grab everybody's information. We do ask that if you have any questions throughout the talk that you post them in the Q&A, not in the chat, because the chat can get quite busy. So please make sure if you have questions that they're going into the Q&A and not the chat. And then use that chat to introduce yourselves, maybe have some conversations about what Dr. Mel is talking about, or just to make connections. So I'll just, because this talk is literally about her and her life journey, it seems always very silly to do a biography. But maybe just to say that our team first ran into Mel at this past year's Consortium for Universities and Global Health annual meeting. And the team was just so inspired by her talk and the thoughtfulness with which she was sharing information that just seemed like a really great fit for this seminar. Mel's an anthropologist by training, and really over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today and for being willing to share your journey.
Thank you, Megan, so much. I'm going to start sharing my screen. One moment. Okay, you can see my slide?
Yep, looking good.
Great. Okay, so let me just begin by saying I'm really honored to be here and to become a part of this network, especially because I truly believe that I wouldn't be anywhere without women in global health having supported me in my career thus far. And as Megan just mentioned, I'm an anthropologist and I'm an early career global health researcher. Personally, and I'm not just saying this to sound modest, but personally, I don't yet consider myself a leader in these fields, but I do find myself being afforded pretty awesome opportunities that I think are setting me up to become one. And so what I want to talk about today in general terms is what I do, how I do it, how it happened, and what I've learned along the way. And then I was hoping in the Q&A, we could collectively talk about where we hope the field of global health goes moving forward. Okay, so as I said, I'm an anthropologist, and anthropology is the study of the figure of man, the logos of anthropos. And that includes not only human beings and their beliefs, not only human beings, but also their beliefs, their knowledges, their technologies, their cultures, and their interactions with the environment and the non-human world. The kind of anthropology that I do is called the anthropology of the contemporary. And that might not be what you think about or what you have in mind at first when you think about anthropology. And it's certainly not what anthropology has been most widely known for since its invention as a field of study in the late 18th century. But basically, it's a minor tradition within the field that studies current and emergent phenomena as they take shape and as they are given form in the present. And the present is itself understood as informed by the recent past, and that which is steering us towards the near future. So within this space, my scholarship has been guided by the question of how to think about being human today. So for example, what is the human from a global health perspective? Or from a One Health perspective, which posits that human and animal and environmental health are inextricably interconnected. or even from like a planetary health perspective, which views the Earth as a biospheric system and humans as an overactive part within that system, capable of disrupting climate patterns and impacting human and non-human health. How is the figure of the human, whether as individual or as a species being, conceptually constructed, categorized, biomedically intervened into, rhetorically mobilized, etc., in the global health sciences? And how do these ways of thinking and practicing global health vary in different parts of the world? And what informs that variation? These are the types of questions that guided my entry into the field of global health and that seem to have positioned me as an emerging thought leader in this space so far. I just want to say, I think I'm framing the presentation in this way because I didn't originally set out to become a global health researcher. And I just, in what follows, I want to tell you briefly about my academic trajectory and growth. But the punchline is that I never received formal training in global health. I learned how to do global health research gradually by doing it. Namely, like upon receiving a global health Fogarty fellowship during my PhD and with the support of mentors along the way. But I also learned how to do global health research by interviewing other global health researchers throughout the years in an anthropological mode, comparing their perspectives on what they think the field is or should be, and asking about how they do it. And eventually by collaborating with them to develop solutions to problems that we identified as shared. Okay, so how did this happen? I trace it back to my undergraduate experience, where the seeds of individualized study and interdisciplinarity were first planted within me. So I went to NYU, and within NYU, the Gallatin School, which was a small school within this wider university, where students were basically able to design their own concentration in lieu of pursuing an undergraduate major. So rather than specializing in any one disciplinary field early on, we were guided by the philosophy that self-directed learning is the key goal, and that we needed to combine disciplines in order to explore the ideas and the themes and the questions that compelled us, and that could be more fully imagined and analyzed by applying multiple methodological lenses and from drawing upon a variety of schools of thought to respond to them. So it's in that context that I first learned how to take an interdisciplinary approach to problem solving and developed my capacities for creative self-development and self-reflection about the world and how I existed in it. Given things like my identity and my positionality in largely unfair social systems, and the impact of language and technology and media on the lived human experience in its multiple forms. That's what I pursued as my concentration as an 18 to 21-year-old who frankly had no idea what I was doing, but really liked thinking about what I was experiencing. And what that experience taught me was that you don't have to follow a track in order to advance your skills and accumulate opportunities for success. I want to just say, don't get me wrong. If, I'm undergoing brain surgery, I really hope that my neurosurgeon is highly specialized in his field. But in the liberal arts and in other applied sciences, including medicine and nursing and public health, there is room to step outside of the box while simultaneously fulfilling the obligations required to succeed within that box. For example, I've taught pre-medical students things from medical anthropology that they might not have been exposed to if they hadn't ventured outside of their required curriculum. And likewise, epidemiologists have taught me things about research design that are completely beyond the scope of anthropology, but that have helped me to practice that more creatively. So just to distill my main point, in terms of what I think has set me up in a basic way for innovation leadership in global health research, it began with learning how to get curious about literally anything and to creatively problem solve by pulling seemingly disparate things together and figuring out how they connect and intersect in meaningful and complex ways. That was a strength. I think a challenge, was that I didn't develop specialized skills, which was the point. But also, again, as a young person, that was kind of scary for a while because I felt like I didn't really know how to do anything other than be interested and interesting. And I remember so many times when I was hanging out with my peers. Um, Often, this happened to me, hanging out with peers of the male persuasion and just being so impressed by their large vocabulary. Like they knew big words like hegemony and ontology, and they used them in sentences with like such mastery and seemingly full grasp of of these big concepts. And I would I would compare myself to them and 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 feel like I wasn't as organically like smart as them. And I spent a lot of time in undergraduate crying to my professors during their office hours, which is kind of embarrassing in hindsight. But that until one of them, a female faculty, basically told me to knock it off. And I didn't realize it at the time, but she offered me a major life lesson, um, which is that in general, and of course, barring certain situations, we're not competing with each other for success and growth. Like if one of my colleagues is thriving, that doesn't take away anything from my ability to also thrive. Like really, there's just so much that to learn from each other and from observing each other's successes and missteps. Um, that was huge for me, and is also particularly meaningful for me now too at this stage in my career where some of us are getting positions and some of us aren't, and like it's just beautiful to be able to celebrate when people do succeed and not to take it like personally that like, oh, if they do you won't or you might not. Okay, so after my undergrad I moved to London to pursue a master's degree. Um, and in hindsight, I think I pursued a master's degree immediately following undergraduate school because I didn't know what else to do. And I felt like I needed more training and skills, and probably it was a way for me to defer making a decision on what field career to pursue. Um, I originally got into a program on social informatics and designing the human computer interface. And a few weeks into that program, I realized that that actually wasn't what I wanted to do. Um, Again, in hindsight, it's also kind of funny because this was in 2010, and like, anyway, with the advent of AI, and that would have been an amazing degree to have. But at the time, it wasn't what I wanted to do. And I was in another country, and my dad flew to Europe with me to move me in. And I felt pressure, but I wasn't happy. And so I spoke to a female faculty member about my distress, and she very pragmatically told me to like find a different program. Uh, so I frantically started reaching out to directors of departments at other universities in England. And I told them about myself and the situation I found myself in, what I was interested in. And I started to ask if there was room for me to transfer into their program. Um, Obviously, asking to bypass the formal application process didn't work at places like Oxford or Cambridge, but I tried. But I did start communicating via email with a faculty member at Goldsmiths who thought I'd be a good fit for their program and asked me to submit my application materials. And then I was accepted into that program, moved to London, which was again, that program was super open in terms of what I was allowed to explore academically, because it focused on critical and creative analysis as a skill set rather than on learning disciplinary content. When I graduated the master's and moved back to New York, I still kind of felt like I didn't have concrete skills that would translate into an obvious job. I got really good at reading about and critiquing science, but I didn't know how to actually do it. And that felt icky to me. So I started searching for research opportunities that would allow me to gain experience in data collection and analysis with human subjects. Um, that was a challenging period in my life because I didn't have a job for a while and I was babysitting for like 3 different families all over the city, and until I finally put out an ad on Craigslist advertising myself and what I could offer to PIs looking for research assistants. Again, Craigslist is like, it's kind of outdated. Like maybe you would do that on LinkedIn today. But in that way, I found one research assistant job that way. And I found another internship because one of the women whose child I watched worked at Columbia. And so she put me in touch with a colleague of hers at their Center for HIV and AIDS. And I, annoyed him through email until I got a meeting, and I interviewed myself in front of him and demonstrated enthusiasm for learning new research skills such that he agreed to let me come work for him for free. And in exchange, he taught me how to do quantitative analysis and manuscript preparation. And I grinded there for almost a year, and I was surprisingly rewarded by being given primary authorship on a paper that I helped to produce with his team. And that was huge for me because all of a sudden I felt like a real researcher, and the whole process of doing research became demystified. That was also the beginning of my entry into health. It's like where I began to care about public health and the people who work in it. Like, I was just curious, why were they doing it? What motivated them, and what did they focus on? And what were they asking, and what weren't they asking because of what they focused on? I remember attending Grand Rounds one day, and there was this preeminent epidemiologist, Dr. Zena Stein, and she was talking about a study that had been conducted in multiple countries in Africa, the results of which suggested that Depo-Provera, which is an injectable hormonal contraceptive, was linked to increased risk of HIV acquisition and seroconversion. But because that study was an observational cohort study, the WHO didn't want to recommend changes to their guidelines of its usage until a randomized control trial was conducted that could confirm like the validity of those findings. And I thought that was so fascinating. Like, what counts as good enough evidence in public health, and who decides that, and how does that influence the types of questions and study designs that researchers ultimately pursue? And so I found Dr. Stein's office in one of the public health buildings, and I knocked on her door and I introduced myself and I asked her these questions. And I mean, I was naive, but she thought that they were really interesting questions that provoked her to think about things she otherwise might have taken for granted. And again, in hindsight, that moment was really encouraging and impactful for me. I think because we were so different in age and in our career stages and in our training and our background, yet we found a way to connect and geek out with each other in what seemed like a mutually enriching way. And this in itself has become like the goal of mine, career wise, to find shared interests with different people and to collaboratively think together and anew about shared problems. Okay, so then in 2012, I moved to California with my ex-husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, because he started his PhD in anthropology at UC Berkeley. And I had already begun thinking about pursuing a PhD myself, but I still felt insecure. Um, like I honestly doubted whether I was smart enough to get a PhD. Um, but as he started the program and I met his cohort and hung out with them, and I talked to him about his classes and I read the books that he was reading so that we could talk about them. Um, Again, it just kind of got demystified. And I began to realize that pursuing a PhD is not about being smart. It's about getting educated. Like you just have to want to. um, and by then I knew I really liked thinking critically about science and that I wanted to pursue either sociology or anthropology of science. Um, Basically, like for me, I think that for me, science is the culture that I study rather than like it being rather than studying an ethnic group, I study scientists and their systems of beliefs and their values and their practices. Um, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. And that year I applied to programs myself and I got accepted into UC Davis's anthropology department. The project that I applied with is not the project I ultimately pursued. It changed because of who I met while I was doing my studies. While at Davis, I got really into multi-species ethnography, which is a mode of research for studying humans through their entanglements with non-human life forms. And my advisor, Joe Dumit, pointed me in the direction of the One Health Center for Excellence on the UC Davis campus because that's where researchers were taking an approach to global health that emphasized the interconnectedness of human, animal, and environmental well-being. And we're examining zoonoses, or diseases that spread from animals to humans, vis-a-vis transdisciplinary collaborative efforts that targeted pathogenic activity at the human environment animal interface. And I met a woman, Dr. Pat Conrad, who was the director of global affairs at the Veterinary School of Medicine. And I told her about my interests. And I think that I was just so different from the other students that she had mentored, coming from biology and veterinary medicine and epidemiology. And yeah, she encouraged me to apply for an NIH Fogarty Fellowship to conduct my anthropological research under the umbrella of global health. I ended up applying and totally missed the mark in terms of the global health grant genre. I think I wrote this really wordy and conceptually complex and like uber reflexive project proposal that just didn't make sense to non-anthropologists. And I didn't get the grant that year. But I did go down to Peru anyway, which is where I thought I wanted to do my research. And I spent a few months there over the summer to meet some of the researchers that I thought I might like to work with. And I think my intent was admittedly to ingratiate myself within that network of researchers and the PIs there with whom I wanted to work, but more importantly, to collect some preliminary data on what questions and problems mattered to them, insofar as these might have been different from what I thought were good questions and significant problems. And because of that, when I applied again the following year, I had a much more practical understanding of what was possible and helpful from the perspective of my international interlocutors. And I also had more people to ask for help when writing the proposal. And I say this all the time. I don't know how anyone applies for positions or wins grants or fellowships without asking people who have done it before or who have experience on the other side of accepting those proposals for guidance. Um, I ended up proposing a project that was legible and relevant for global health, and I won that grant to undertake a mixed methods study comparing how Latin American and North American researchers conceptualized and defined the field of global health. And I used that fellowship to simultaneously pursue the research for my anthropology dissertation, which was studying the integration of One Health principles into field epidemiological studies of endemic zoonoses. So I did two projects simultaneously that were different yet interrelated. And that was a lot of work, but it was also a strategic choice that I made to acquire funding and to be an anthropologist of global health from a more meta perspective, and to be an anthropologist in global health from in a more applied sense. Um, so doing anthropology in and of global health meant that I was able to pursue rigorous empirical inquiry into concepts like what is the global in global health? What is health in global health? How do epidemiologists think about contagion? How do they figure the pathogen? How do they figure the human? I was also examining the extent to which the One Health approach catalyzed new ways of understanding and intervening into disease dynamics, and what forms of methodological and conceptual innovation in global public health research and implementation became possible when environmental health science, veterinary medicine, community ecology, for example, were integrated into the epidemiological purview. And the way that I did that was really just by listening to the points of people and thinking about what disease is and how it happens from the perspective of non-human animals and also the pathogens. Um, I think that this approach, uh, the approach that I took, like decentering the human when thinking about global health problems and innovations. Let me say that again. I think that this approach, like decentering the human when thinking about global health problems and potential solutions, um, is innovative and was really inspired by One Health. Um, but one of the things that I learned from this field work is that despite the conceptual innovations of the One Health approach, um, which is like to think beyond human health alone, it's actually really hard for practitioners in the field to actually do that. Um, at the end of the day, I think that folks in global health are still primarily concerned with human health above animal and environmental health. Um, and that our solutions to problems that are interconnected still tend to be limited to interventions at the human level, primarily, which is kind of a bummer because there's so much room for innovation if we challenge ourselves to think beyond the human and the human level. One thing I just wanted to add about this period in my life and career is that when I came back from field work, I had spent 16 months in Peru. But when I came back, I joined the CUGH, which is the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. And I joined their trainee advisory committee. And part of that that program is that as a trainee, you can join some of the CUGH's other committees. So I joined the research committee. And basically what happened is that I used that network as a platform for disseminating some of my ideas. I felt really, really supported in the CUGH network, again, by female, more senior female colleagues who I reached out to, developed relationships with, and I got the sense that they felt like I was bringing fresh ideas to the table. And what's funny to me is that my ideas may not be inherently fresh in anthropology, but they seem to be so in global health. And I think that's because, across disciplinary divides, I'm like this exotic anthropologist from a different world with different ways of thinking, but that has really, really worked to my benefit. Um, and so it's at CUGH where I began to feel like I belonged in global health, like became part of a community. I was still naive. Um, I remember one of the first research committee meetings. They were talking about they needed to pick agenda topics, um, and I raised my hand and I said, and this was during the pandemic, and I said, the problem of misinformation and vaccine hesitancy and just general distrust of public health authority and science like seems like a really interesting problem space. Maybe that would be an idea for a working group. And they were like, great, you're in charge of the working group. I had no idea how to lead a working group, but I figured it out by doing it. And really, I took the ball and ran with it. It felt like an opportunity and it felt like a platform. And I designed sessions at two of their annual conferences and invited speakers from different fields to talk about this problem from a transdisciplinary perspective and to get the global health community to think in an open-minded way about like what the problem is and how best to research it. While I was finishing my dissertation, I joined another collective. It was called Hearth Grotto, and it's like H. Earth. And it brought together anthropologists and biologists to think about the relationships between humans and Earth as mutually constitutive and not as separate categories, right? Like sometimes we think about like human versus nature, but what if we thought about that nature in humans and humans in nature? And that's where I met Dr. Megan Palmer, who is a bioengineer and had just created a program at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. And the program she created was called Biopolis, and it was intended to run research at the intersection of biology and society and policy debate. And I learned about a postdoc opportunity at her program. And I only learned about that opportunity because I joined this collective. And so one of the lessons that like I want to impart is really just to join networks because opportunities can arise there. And when they do, you can seize them. So I learned about this postdoc opportunity. I researched the position. I wasn't really quite what they were looking for, but there were enough overlaps between my research and what the research they wanted to do. What they were, yeah. And so I set up some meetings with Megan. I made sure that I hit all the right buzzwords, right? Like it was a security postdoc. So I talked about how in my dissertation, like I also examined how One Health was integrated into governance tools for strengthening global health security. I really emphasized that part to make myself legible to the aims of her program and the parameters of that position. And we liked each other, and she wanted me to apply, and she helped me to apply. And I segued or deepened my existing work in One Health to be relevant in a global health biosecurity space. And basically what ended up happening is that they really liked my application and they created a position for me that didn't exist so that I could join the team. Like they found the person that they wanted to fill the position that they advertised for, but then they also moved funds around to create a fellowship for me because they thought what I proposed was important and interesting, even though they hadn't advertised it or even necessarily thought about it before I proposed it. And I just feel like there's a valuable lesson there to promote yourself and to forge your own career. Like, definitely apply to positions that are advertised for, but also if there's something that you really want to do, like, often you can not, I don't know if it's often or not, but sometimes you can help create it. Like, maybe you want to do something that is really interesting that doesn't exist yet, but could or should. I also, at this stage, in my postdoc, and I'm doing it still, and I'm there for one more year. Another lesson that I have learned is that burnout is real. Um, and I think that a way to avoid it is by staying grounded in what your motivations are. Like, what, who are you doing it for? I feel like for me, it has always been really helpful to know, like, who am I wanting to help? Like, individual people, right? Like, not just like, I want to help. Maybe this works for some people, right? Like, I want to, um, help pregnant women, um, improve their health status, right? In resource poor countries, right? Maybe that, right? Or, but like for me, like, who is that person? Who is the woman that you have in mind? Like, keeping it grounded, keeping it personal and human, I think is a way to stay motivated, stay inspired, and to avoid burnout. And I'm at this point right now in my life and in my career where I'm deciding what to do next. And the options feel like, do I want to continue in academia, or do I want to go outside of academia and pursue industry? And I'm thinking about, like, I need to decide now, but I'm still thinking about it. Because I feel like there's different impacts that you can make in these different fields. I feel like for me, the impact that I can make in academia, and that is most meaningful for me, is working with younger generations, um, in designing ways to think innovatively, about the field of global health and the direction we hope to see it go moving forward. And of course, you can make different kinds of impact outside of academia, right? Like making things like, for more people. But this is an ongoing question for me. Okay, so with this imagery, I wanted to basically intimate that career advancement is not only a trajectory. I thought about maybe like making a winding road or a timeline, but I realized, that it's not necessarily a linear, it's not necessarily a trajectory, but advancing your career, it's really about accumulating skills. And I also, with this tree imagery, want to normalize that you don't need to know what form you will take or how you will become who you become. It happens. So for me, over time, I acquired skills and experiences, and my capacities expanded. Right. In the last few years, I've written essays and viewpoints, and I've published original research articles and book chapters, co-produced policy reports. I've presented my research at conferences and for professional networks like this one, and I've organized my own symposia. I've mentored undergraduates in qualitative research methods, and all of that really happened like a lot more recently, and also after I entered global health. And I think that might be because of a few things. Like, obviously can't rule out the fact that, like, as I developed more capacities and got more confidence, I was able to do more things. But I also think that it's because there are a ton of opportunities in global health, if you seize them. And also that the field is really wide ranging and that so much falls under the umbrella of global health concerns, and that there are so many entry points and areas to become an expert in. And that there's also an openness in the field in its present moment where it's revisionary and it's asking itself in a reflective mode, what is global health and like what matters and how should we advance the field and what should be on the agenda. And so there's just so much research and practice to pursue within this umbrella. Okay, so today my research portfolio is philosophically inclined, it's empirically grounded, and lately it's become more policy facing. And overall, it's super eclectic. And I think I like working in different areas in global health at the same time because it helps me to stay creative and intellectually stimulated. For me, being interdisciplinary has allowed me to traverse different fields and also to make new fields between those fields. Um, and and in this kind of insider outsider position, to be able to see blind spots that specialists might not necessarily see. And that has become the mode upon which I'm trying to build a career. And I think that that's how I get perceived as innovative and where I can make the most impact, hopefully, when it comes to broadening the scope of global health, um, by getting to be many things simultaneously and for different audiences, and by challenging practitioners in the field to ask different, if not better, questions and to seek more nuanced and complicated solutions. I just wanted to offer this as a case study, and I actually want to wrap this up because I'd love time for Q&A. But just as an example, so I mentioned that I was working in the CUGH Research Committee working group on mistrust of science, and originally that working group was called Addressing the Anti-Science Movement. And the name change is significant because honestly, the first year when it was called Addressing the Anti-Science Movement, I think that I was following the lead of my senior colleagues who were concerned about vaccine hesitancy and climate change denialism and the spread of COVID-19 misinformation as prime examples of a so-called anti-science attitude that negatively impacted global health efforts. And what I began to realize is that those are three priority issues that global health researchers tend to privilege, and that examining and intervening into those areas is imperative. But it's critical that we not only focus on present polemics at the expense of a fuller and more critically reflexive interrogation of an emerging social phenomenon. By calling it anti-science, this social phenomena as anti-science, by labeling it as that, we kind of already were like assuming that we knew what it was, that was people who didn't believe in science, and also that this term was really polarizing. And I tried to push my colleagues to resist that framing, and to begin thinking about, well, is it really anti-science, or like are sometimes things like vaccine hesitancy motivated by things that have nothing to do with science at all, or not only about science? And I wanted to try to envision a future where science and its dissenters could create community by listening to and becoming more willing to listen to learn about each other, and to think about the problem of distrust from a variety of angles. And so one intervention that I helped to spearhead in the context of the research committee was that the problem of mistrust is not reducible to the problem of misinformation. It's a wider problem, and it has to do with attitudes towards governance and matters of value, more so than misinformation or matters of fact or what's true or not. And in terms of impact, I think that remains open. This is still an ongoing initiative. But it feels like a really important one for me, a way to reframe something in the global health debate that makes it more nuanced and makes it more curious, and that creates and more humble. Okay, I just want to wrap it up. In terms of takeaways, what's worked for me, right, is to question assumptions, and practicing epistemic humility. Like, how do you know what you know, and how does what other people know challenge what you think you know, and how can you relearn know things differently together. Also, like, don't be afraid to think outside the box, and or you don't have to or don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Often that is what leads to innovation. I think that there's this teenage punk rocker girl inside of me that just wants to burn everything down. But what I've learned is, like, it requires a 1-2 punch. So you can provoke and point out blind spots and how people's assumptions are getting in the way from them achieving their objectives. But then you have to follow that up with an invitation to work on the problems together. Like, can't just critique, also have to collaborate. And the last thing I just wanted to say is, like, because this truly feels so meaningful to me, is that I like I said at the beginning, I wouldn't be here if women hadn't mentored me, and also male feminist allies. And what's been so important for me is to give back what I've received. As soon as I learn a new skill and feel like I have mastery over it, I try to impart it to others and try to lift up other women who are younger than me, to bring them into research projects, to give them primary authorship, to boost them. It just, when you get to a certain stage in your career, you're lucky, and or you're fortunate, and it feels really important to share, and to give that back and pay that forward. All right, I want to stop there because I'd love to take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Mel, for your talk. Before we get into questions, Q&A, I just want to give a couple of reminders. So a reminder that this seminar series is part of a greater initiative on emerging women leaders in global health. And that if you haven't joined our Slack network, we do have a vibrant community of over 1,100 people. And Megan's about to post the link in the chat so that you can join us and hang out in Slack with us. Also, please save the date for our next networking event that will be on September 28th. And this represents a great opportunity to practice some skills and network with others. So Mel, thank you again for your talk. There were just a couple of things that really resonated that I want to pull out. You know, something you said really early on is celebrate when others succeed. You don't have to take it personally, right? It's not about you, it can be about them. And really, to your point about lifting people up, right? Being really celebratory for others. It's also a good look, right? And I think people remember that. You also said burnout is real, right? Yeah. And how can you avoid it? You can stay grounded in your motivations. But I think for so many of us, you know, at different times, we're really feeling burnout. I think that's great advice. You talked a lot about building relationships and just asking. This is a motto I definitely live by, just ask, because what's the worst that can happen? Someone says no, you know, but what's the best that can happen is everything else, right? Like every other alternative is the best. So you just have to ask. And then I think, like, really critically, something that people need to hear is that you don't need to know what you're going to become. It just happens. And that we have so much emphasis, right? Like, what's your 5-year plan? What's your 10-year plan? What do you want to be? And it's just like, it's exhausting. It's an exhausting process to live through. So I think that's really beautiful advice. We've got some questions in the Q&A. And let's start with Shay's. So Shay asks, how do you assess the extent to which potential opportunities will be healthy and mutually beneficial? The exploitation of young researchers seems like a huge problem that's really hard to navigate, especially when you're talking about unpaid work.
Yeah.
Good question, Shay.
Yeah, it's not cool. I guess it's a personal decision, right? It's a give and take. For me, you know, when I talked about that example at that stage in my life when I was back in New York, and I I was making money through I was nannying, and I was making money, and then somehow like almost enough to support myself in New York City, but I wasn't fulfilled, and I wanted to I wanted um, to gain experience. And so I made the personal choice that, in order to get what I wanted, um, I made the choice of what I would be willing to do. Um, that said, now that I have further advanced and I'm in a position where I've been able to work with research assistants, I don't exploit their labor. So one of the things that I did when I was doing my PhD, and I worked with some undergraduate research assistants who helped me to co-write a systematic literature review, is that I didn't have funds personally to pay them, but my mentors did. And I asked one of them, like Pat Conrad, I told her about the work I wanted to do and the research assistance I needed and why I thought it was a good idea. And she paid them to help me. And she did that to support me and to also support me as a female supporting other females, and because she was in a position where she could. Um, Today at Stanford, I have some research assistants, and again, I don't have personal funding to pay them. But we what we can offer is an independent study, so they can get credits uh, for doing research in a kind of independent study where like I'm imparting skills that they want to learn and teaching them, and then they can get academic credits for the work that they do. So I don't know, those have been some of the ways that I've navigated this problem and the exploitation of younger students. And I guess would encourage you to, if you want to do research assistance and there aren't funds available, to figure out, ways to procure it, or things that could kind of also be beneficial for you, even if they're not monetary.
Thanks, Mel. I think that points to some good strategies that we can use, right? I'm sure part of that is also just ask. I wonder if Shay's perspective, though, is on the other side of that. Like, how do you really assess potential opportunities? Like, how do you assess them for their health, right? Will they be healthy for you? Will they really be mutually beneficial if you're the one who's looking to grow and do this work?
Will they be healthy for the person who's looking for opportunities? I think that that's a personal judgment um, that one would have to make in any particular circumstance. Um,
I might add, Shay, from my own perspective, I think it's so much more important who you work with than the work that you do. And so part of assessing that health is like, what have you heard about that person? What is it like to work with them? Almost more than any of the tasks, right? And that might also speak to your vision of the tree, Mel, right? That like you don't have to know where you're going to go. You don't have to have all of the skills right away, and you never know what you'll get out of an opportunity.
I think that's a really great point. Like, yeah, don't if you sense toxicity, get out.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Totally.
Yes,
Okay, we have another question. From your experience and research of how we do global health, what are some of the biggest barriers and opportunities to shift power dynamics to allow colleagues from the majority world to really lead the research agenda?
uh-huh. I love that question. Okay, so for me, this is a question about decolonizing global health. And I'm just gonna pull up something because yeah. Okay, so what are the challenges and opportunities for shifting power dynamics in global health? And man, it's it's a big question. It's like such an important question. Okay, so for me, I think it begins with basically acknowledging how those power high imbalances and how hierarchies got there in the first place. So that requires acknowledging how legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism and neoliberalism are present today in the dynamics of global health knowledge production and knowledge transfer, and in the directionality of capacity building and funding dependencies within the global health apparatus. And it requires acknowledging that specifically because the inequalities and the power dynamics that we are seeing today, they are systemic and they are structural, meaning that like at particular points and times in history, they were deliberately constructed to be there. So if we intend to undo or undermine or at the least minimize them, then we have to make deliberate systemic changes according to the ideas and perspectives and values of those that have been formally colonized. And how to actually do that is, I mean, I think it has to start with dialogue, but it's really tricky because like I don't know how to convince people who are in positions of power and privilege to relinquish it. Practically, I'm that seems like a huge challenge. So I don't know, barring like worldwide revolution.
There's
I'm
that burn it all down mentality, Mel. You're like, let's just light it on fire.
yeah, I'm not sure. It's really, really tricky. And I think that it begins with humility and sharing space and resources, and more inclusion and and diversity, and probably like sacrificing, from those who are in positions of power to do the right thing to make things more equitable. So, and that would require incentives. But I don't know. It's a really complicated but really crucial area that we need more leadership in designing like implementable solutions moving forward.
Great, thanks, Mel, for your answer to that very complicated question. I think we're at one, but I want to ask just one more if you'll allow. And it's about the statement that you made that you don't need to know what you'll become, it just happens. What recommendations do you have for people who are constantly faced with the opposite idea, right? Like, what's your 5-year plan? What's your 10-year plan? Like, what do you want to be? Where do you want to go? In the face of like our society, our structures that ask that so much, what's your advice for people to like really embrace your advice there?
I think that 5-year plans are really useful tools. I've made I have many iterations of my 5-year plan, and they help me at different points in time to kind of focus my interests and just kind of check in with myself on like what matters to me, what do I care about, what would I like to where what would give me joy if I succeeded in this. And so it's a nice kind of reflexive exercise and tool for just checking in with yourself and also pushing yourself. Sometimes creating deadlines for yourself can be motivating. I also, I don't know, it's not an either or thing, right? Like, I think being on a track, there's a lot of security that comes with that, knowing what you're doing and where it's going to take you. And I've wanted that and needed that at different points in my career. But I think as a kind of overall attitude and ethos, what I'm trying to impart is like, we don't usually have as much control as we think we do. And things just kind of happen by accident that end up opening worlds. And so just being open to that I think can help emotionally as you're moving through it. And I don't know, just make the journey a little bit less stressful for you.
Yeah, maybe it's about like creating 5-year plans that are really more about identifying your values and like broadly where you might go, but not every step you need to take to get there. Great. Okay, to our participants, thank you all so much for joining us today. Mel, we have a perfect. We had a request for your contact information, so the email is now in the chat. All of you, if you're not already in our Edge Slack network, please do join us and save the date for that networking event at the end of the month. Mel, again, thank you very much. This is our first seminar for the academic